Captain Jake Morrison, stood on the bridge of Aurora 7 watching the massive alien ships appear from nowhere like ghosts, materializing in the void of space around Earth's outer colonies, and his coffee cup trembled in his hand as the scanner showed him numbers that made no sense because there were 50 of them, maybe more, and each one was bigger than anything humans had ever built, and they moved with a grace that spoke of technology far beyond what Earth possessed, the communication array crackled to life, and Lieutenant Amy Chun turned from her station with wide eyes, saying the aliens were broadcasting on multiple frequencies in perfect English, which somehow made everything more terrifying because it meant they had been watching humanity for who knows how long, and Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized Earth was completely unprepared for this moment that every science fiction writer had dreamed about and every military planner had nightmares about. Jake straightened his uniform and walked to the communication console, telling Amy to open a channel, and he cleared his throat before speaking into the microphone with as much calm as he could manage, saying, "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Human Space Station, Aurora 7, representing Earth and its colonies, and we welcome you to our system and hope we can establish peaceful relations between our peoples." And he waited for a response that would change everything. The alien voice that came back was cold and mechanical, like it was being filtered through machines that stripped away any emotion, and the words hit Jake like physical blows as the voice said, "We are the Zephyrian Galactic Empire, and you are nothing but primitive mammals living on a world that now belongs to us, and your pathetic attempts at space travel end today, because this system and everything in it is now property of Emperor Zolfax." Jake looked around the bridge at his crew and saw the same shock and disbelief on every face, because they had always imagined first contact would involve diplomacy and cultural exchange and maybe some awkward moments as two species tried to understand each other, but this was something else entirely, and the alien voice continued, saying, "You will surrender all military assets and prepare your planet for resource extraction, and any resistance will be met with immediate termination." Amy Chen was recording everything, and Jake could see her hands shaking as she worked the controls. And he knew she was thinking the same thing which was that Earth had no idea this was happening because the aliens had somehow appeared without triggering any of the early warning systems, and by the time Earth knew about the invasion it might already be over. Jake took a deep breath and activated the communication system again, saying, "We appreciate your contact with our species, but we would prefer to discuss this through proper diplomatic channels, and perhaps we can find a solution that benefits both our peoples, because surely there is room in the galaxy for cooperation rather than conquest." And he tried to keep his voice steady. Even though his heart was pounding, the response came faster this time, and the alien voice carried something that might have been amusement if machines could laugh, and it said, "There will be no negotiation with inferior species, and you have exactly 72 hours to surrender completely, or we will demonstrate why resistance is futile." And the transmission cut off, leaving the bridge in terrible silence. That was when the alien ships opened fire on the mining stations scattered throughout the outer system, and Jake watched in horror as 3 civilian installations simply vanished in brilliant flashes of light that lasted only seconds, and he knew that thousands of people had just died, including families and children who had been living peaceful lives on those stations. Amy Chun was frantically trying to contact the stations, and her voice cracked as she reported no response from Mining Station 7 or Mining Station 12 or Mining Station 15, and the scanners showed nothing but debris where they used to be, and Jake realized the aliens had just murdered 2,000 innocent people as casually as swatting flies. The alien voice returned, and this time it was broadcasting to every human settlement in the system, saying, "This is what happens to those who question the authority of the Zephyrian Empire, and your species now has 71 hours and 53 minutes to surrender unconditionally and prepare for imperial occupation, and any further defiance will result in similar demonstrations of power." Jake ordered Amy to send an emergency transmission to Earth Command, and he watched her fingers fly over the controls as she compressed everything they had witnessed into a data burst that would reach Earth in just over 2 hours, and he knew that in 2 hours Earth would learn that humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and that their new neighbors wanted them dead or enslaved. Amy looked up from her console with tears in her eyes, and Jake could see she was trying to stay professional, but the sight of those mining stations being destroyed had shaken her to the core, and she said, "The message is away, Captain," and then she said something that would echo through human space for years to come, saying, "Well, they just messed around. And now they are going to find out what happens. When you murder innocent people," Jake nodded and began issuing orders to evacuate all civilian personnel from the remaining stations while sending detailed scans of the alien ships to Earth Command, and he knew the next 72 hours would determine whether humanity survived as a free species or became slaves to an empire that saw them as nothing more than talking animals. The alien ships moved into defensive positions around the system like they owned it, which Jake supposed they did now, according to their way of thinking, and he wondered if they had done this to countless other species across the galaxy, and how many civilizations had simply rolled over and accepted slavery rather than fight against impossible odds. But as Jake watched the debris from the mining stations drift through space, he felt something building inside him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the righteous anger that comes when bullies pick on someone they think cannot fight back. And he realized the aliens had made their first mistake by assuming humans would react like every other species they had conquered. Amy Chun finished sending the tactical data to Earth and turned to Jake, saying, "All civilian evacuations are complete, Captain, and the remaining personnel are military only." And Jake nodded, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just his fate or the fate of everyone on Aurora 7, but the fate of every human being alive. The countdown had begun, and somewhere on Earth people were about to learn that the universe was a much more dangerous place than they had ever imagined. And Jake Morrison stood on his bridge watching alien warships that could destroy planets and wondered if humanity was about to join the long list of species that had underestimated the Zephyrian Empire, or if the Empire was about to learn why you should never threaten the home of a species that had spent its entire history learning how to kill things bigger and stronger than themselves. The emergency session of the United Earth Defense Council began exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes after Jake Morrison sent his data burst from Aurora 7, and President Lisa Taylor sat at the head of the conference table looking at faces that showed the same mixture of shock and disbelief that she felt herself, because nobody had expected first contact to begin with the murder of 2,000 innocent civilians. General Kyle Rodriguez stood at the front of the room next to a holographic display showing the alien fleet, and his voice was calm and professional as he explained what they were facing, but Lisa could see the anger burning in his eyes as he described ships that could vaporize mining stations in seconds, and an empire that had apparently been watching humanity for years without making contact. The room fell silent as they watched the recording of the alien ultimatum, and Lisa felt her hands clench into fists as the mechanical voice dismissed humanity as primitive mammals and threatened to demonstrate why resistance was futile, and she realized that everything they had worked to build was about to be tested by an enemy that saw them as nothing more than talking animals. Defense Minister Carol Stevens was the first to speak, and her voice shook with rage as she said, "These aliens think they can just waltz into our system and demand surrender after murdering our people." And Lisa nodded because she felt the same fury, but she also knew that anger without a plan would get everyone killed. General Rodriguez cleared his throat and said, "There is something you need to know about our defensive capabilities," and Lisa felt a flicker of hope, because Kyle had always been a careful planner, and if he thought they had options, then maybe the situation was not as hopeless as it appeared. And she told him to continue. What happened next changed everything, because Kyle activated a classified display that showed ships and weapons and defensive systems that Lisa had never seen before, and he explained that for the past 30 years, Earth had been preparing for exactly this scenario through a program called the Sleeping Giant Protocol. DR Kevin Hayes stepped forward, and Lisa recognized him as the head of advanced weapons research, but she had never known the true scope of his work, and he began explaining how they had been reverse engineering alien artifacts recovered from probe crashes and derelict ships found drifting in space, and using that technology to build humanity's hidden arsenal. The holographic display lit up with images of sleek warships that looked nothing like the bulky vessels humanity used for civilian purposes, and Dr. Hayes explained that these ships used quantum drives and adaptive armor and weapon systems that could match anything the Zephyrians had shown so far, and Lisa felt her heart racing as she realized Earth was not as defenseless as everyone thought. Admiral Susan Park joined the briefing and explained that they had been building a secret fleet for decades using mining operations and asteroid facilities as cover, and the ships were hidden throughout the solar system waiting for the activation code that would bring them online, and she said they had 47 combat vessels ready for immediate deployment. Lisa looked around the room at faces that were no longer showing despair, but were beginning to show something that looked like hope mixed with determination, and she asked how many people knew about the sleeping giant protocol, and Kyle said fewer than 500 across all branches of government and military, and every one of them had signed documents that carried the death penalty for disclosure. Dr. Hayes continued his briefing, explaining that they had developed weapon systems based on principles that human scientists had discovered by studying alien technology, and these weapons could penetrate the energy shields that protected Zephyrian ships, and he showed computer simulations of human plasma cannons cutting through alien armor like it was paper. The president asked about personnel, and Admiral Park explained that they had been training crews in secret for years, using simulator programs that were supposedly for civilian space operations but were actually combat training systems, and they had 3,000 experienced combat pilots ready to deploy within hours of receiving orders. General Rodriguez activated another display showing defensive installations throughout the solar system and explained that what appeared to be research stations and communication arrays were actually weapon platforms that could create overlapping fields of fire around Earth. And Lisa realized that her military had been preparing for war while she thought they were preparing for peace. The briefing continued with details about quantum communication systems that could not be intercepted, and stealth technology that could hide human ships from alien sensors, and advanced manufacturing facilities that could produce weapons and ammunition faster than any conventional factory. And Lisa began to understand that humanity had been building toward this moment for 3 decades. Dr. Hayes showed them recordings of weapons tests that demonstrated human technology could match Zephyrian capabilities, and he explained that the aliens might have superior numbers, but humans had spent years studying their technology and tactics and had developed countermeasures for every system they had observed. Admiral Park brought up the tactical situation and explained that the Zephyrian fleet was positioned defensively around the outer system, which suggested they expected humanity to surrender rather than fight, and this gave human forces the advantage of surprise because the aliens had no idea what they were really facing. Lisa asked about the timeline, and Kyle explained that they could have the fleet deployed and ready for combat within 18 hours, which would give them almost 2 full days to prepare before the alien deadline expired, and he said the element of surprise would be crucial because once the aliens realized humanity could fight back, they would adapt their tactics. The president looked around the room at her advisors and asked for honest assessments of their chances, and Admiral Park said they were facing a numerically superior enemy with proven technology, but humanity had advantages in creativity and adaptability that alien empires typically lacked, and she believed they could win if they struck hard and fast. Dr. Hayes added that human weapons were designed to exploit weaknesses in Zephyrian technology that the aliens probably did not realize they had, because their empire had grown so large and successful that they had become overconfident and stopped innovating, and this gave humanity a technological edge. Despite their smaller numbers, General Rodriguez said the key would be making the aliens pay such a high price for their aggression that they would think twice about continuing the invasion, and if humanity could destroy enough of their fleet in the first engagement, the Zephyrians might decide that conquering Earth was not worth the cost. Lisa Taylor stood up and looked at each person in the room, and she thought about the 2,000 people who had died on those mining stations and about the billions of humans who were depending on the decisions made in this room, and she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She asked if everyone was certain that humanity could fight back effectively, and Kyle Rodriguez nodded, saying they had spent 30 years preparing for this day, and the sleeping giant protocol was designed specifically to give humanity a fighting chance against technologically superior enemies, and he believed they could not only survive but win president? Taylor took a deep breath and said the Zephyrian Empire thinks they are dealing with primitive mammals who will roll over and surrender when threatened, and they murdered our people to make a point about their power, and now they are about to learn that humanity does not respond to bullies the way they expect. She authorized the activation of the sleeping giant protocol and ordered all classified military assets to be brought online immediately, and she told General Rodriguez to prepare for full combat operations and to make sure the aliens understood that humanity would not go quietly into slavery. The room erupted into controlled chaos as officers began implementing battle plans that had been theoretical until this moment. And Lisa watched them work and realized that the Zephyrian Empire had just made the worst mistake in their long history of conquest because they had chosen to threaten a species that had never learned how to give up. The 72-hour deadline expired at exactly 1400 hours. Earth Standard Time, and Admiral Vexstar of the Zephyrian Fleet expected to receive a transmission of unconditional surrender from the primitive mammals who called themselves humans, but instead his sensors detected something that made his blood run cold because the space around Earth was suddenly filled with warships that had not been there moments before. Captain Lisa Park stood on the bridge of the flagship Retribution and felt the familiar weight of command settle on her shoulders as she watched the tactical display show human vessels materializing from stealth positions throughout the solar system, and she knew this was the moment that would determine whether humanity lived free or died fighting. The quantum communication system crackled to life, and she heard Admiral Rodriguez giving final orders to the fleet commanders, and his voice was steady and calm as he said, "This is for everyone who died on those mining stations, and for everyone who will die if we fail here today, and make them pay for every meter of space they try to take." Commander Tony Mitchell checked the status of his stealth destroyer squadron and reported all ships ready for combat operations, and Lisa nodded because Tony had trained for this moment his entire career, and his ships carried the experimental weapons that Dr. Hayes promised could penetrate Zephyrian shields and armor the alien fleet. Began moving from their defensive positions, and Lisa could see on her tactical display that they were arranging themselves in the standard Imperial battle formation that had conquered hundreds of worlds, but she also knew from classified intelligence reports that this formation had a critical weakness that human tacticians had identified years ago. Admiral Vexstar broadcast a message demanding to know where the human ships had come from, and his voice carried confusion and growing anger as he said the primitive mammals were supposed to surrender, not reveal hidden fleets, and Lisa smiled grimly as she realized the aliens were experiencing their first surprise in probably decades. Lisa activated the fleet communication system and spoke to every human ship in the battle group, saying the aliens think we are primitive mammals who will roll over when threatened, but they murdered our people, and now they get to learn what happens when you pick a fight with humans. And she could feel the determination radiating from every ship in the fleet. The first shots of the battle came from the Zephyrian heavy cruisers, and their energy weapons lit up the void of space with brilliant colors that would have been beautiful if they were not designed to kill. And Lisa watched the beams strike the adaptive armor of human ships and saw them absorbed and redirected in ways that made the aliens pause in confusion. Commander Mitchell led his destroyer squadron in a flanking maneuver that took advantage of the quantum stealth systems, and his ships appeared behind the alien battle line like ghosts materializing from nightmares, and his plasma torpedoes struck 3 Zephyrian ships before they could react, and Lisa watched alien vessels explode in ways their designers never intended. The Zephyrian fleet tried to reform their battle line, but human ships moved with an unpredictability that their tactical computers could not process, and Captain Danny Clark coordinated strike groups that hit enemy vessels from multiple angles simultaneously while avoiding return fire through maneuvers that looked impossible to the aliens. Dr. Susan Wells monitored the battle from the command ship, and her xenobiology team analyzed Zephyrian communication intercepts, and she discovered that the aliens were becoming increasingly frustrated because their standard tactics were not working and their commanders were arguing about how to respond to human creativity. Admiral Vexstar tried to reassert control by ordering his ships to target the largest human vessels, but Lisa had anticipated this, and she ordered the fleet to implement Pattern Omega, which made the human ships appear to scatter randomly while actually executing a complex tactical maneuver that drew the aliens into a trap. The Retribution took heavy fire as it served as bait for the alien fleet, and Lisa felt the ship shake under the impact of energy weapons that could melt mountains, but the adaptive armor held, and the quantum shield generators distributed the damage in ways that kept them fighting, and she knew her ship was tougher than the aliens. Expected Commander Tony Mitchell brought his destroyers back into the fight from an unexpected angle, and his quantum torpedoes struck the Zephyrian flagship just as Admiral Vexstar was trying to coordinate his fleet, and the explosion tore through the alien command ship like it was made of paper, and Lisa saw the alien battle formation begin to collapse. Human fleet pressed their advantage, and Lisa ordered all ships to implement aggressive pursuit tactics that prevented the aliens from regrouping, and she watched human captains use maneuvers that violated every conventional rule of space combat, but worked because they were fighting an enemy that had grown predictable through centuries of easy victories. Engineer Brad Thompson monitored the performance of the new weapon systems from his position on the Retribution, and he reported that human technology was performing better than expected because the aliens had not adapted their defenses to counter weapons based on principles they did not understand, and their shields were failing under sustained fire. The battle raged for 6 hours, and Lisa watched the tactical display show Zephyrian ships being destroyed or disabled faster than they could respond, and she realized that human forces were not just holding their own, but were actually winning against an enemy that had never faced serious resistance. Admiral Vexstar tried to order a tactical withdrawal, but human ships pursued the fleeing aliens, and Captain Lisa Park coordinated a pincer movement that trapped the remaining Zephyrian vessels between two human battle groups, and she knew the aliens were experiencing their first military defeat in centuries. The final phase of the battle saw Commander Mitchell leading a boarding action against a disabled Zephyrian cruiser, and his Marines used combat suits that incorporated alien technology improvements, and they captured the enemy ship along with its crew and valuable intelligence about Imperial military capabilities. Dr. Susan Wells began interrogating captured Zephyrian officers, as she discovered critical information about their physiology that could be exploited in future battles, and she learned that the alien empire had grown so large and successful that they had stopped expecting resistance, and their military had become overconfident and inflexible. Lisa Park stood on her bridge watching the debris field that had once been a proud Imperial fleet, and she knew this victory would send shockwaves throughout the Zephyrian Empire, because for the first time in their history, they had encountered a species that not only refused to surrender but had actually defeated them in battle. The communication system activated, and Admiral Rodriguez congratulated the fleet on their victory, but he also warned that this was just the beginning, because the Empire would not accept defeat easily, and they would send larger forces to crush human resistance, and Lisa knew the real war was just starting. Captain Danny Clark reported that human casualties were surprisingly light considering they had just fought their first major space battle, and Lisa realized that 30 years of preparation and planning had paid off, because humanity had been ready for this moment even if most people did not know it. Engineer Brad Thompson analyzed the wreckage of alien ships, and he discovered technology that could be reverse engineered to improve human weapons and defenses, and he said the aliens had just provided humanity with the tools they would need to fight the larger battles that were coming. Lisa looked at the tactical display showing human ships regrouping after their victory, and she thought about the mining stations that had been destroyed and the 2,000 people who had died, and she knew their sacrifice had not been in vain, because humanity had proven they could fight back against impossible odds. The first battle was over, but Lisa Park knew it was just the opening move in a war that would determine whether humanity remained free or became another conquered species in the Zephyrian Empire, and she ordered her fleet to prepare for the larger conflicts that were certainly coming, because the aliens had just learned that humans do not surrender, and now they would want revenge. Emperor Zulithax received the news of Admiral Vexstar's defeat while sitting on his throne made from the crystallized remains of the last species that had dared to resist imperial expansion, and for the first time in 3 centuries of conquest, he felt something that might have been fear mixed with rage, because no primitive species had ever destroyed an entire Zephyrian battle fleet. Grand Admiral Morduch stood before the Emperor trying to explain how a species that barely had interstellar travel had managed to defeat experienced imperial forces, and his voice carried disbelief as he described human tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare and ships that appeared from nowhere, using technology that should not exist. The Emperor's advisors whispered among themselves about the implications of this defeat, because news was already spreading throughout the Empire, and conquered species were beginning to ask questions about imperial invincibility, and some were even suggesting that resistance might be possible if the humans could do it. Solthax stood from his throne, and his voice echoed through the vast chamber as he declared that no species of primitive mammals would be allowed to humiliate the Empire, and he ordered Grand Admiral Morduch to assemble the Imperial War fleet and destroy every human world so thoroughly that nothing would remain but space dust and warnings to other species. The Imperial War fleet had not been assembled for over a century, because no enemy had ever required such massive force, but now 500 of the Empire's most advanced warships began converging on the staging area, and each ship carried weapons that could crack planets and crews that had never known defeat. Meanwhile, in the Sol system, Colonel Ryan Foster studied intelligence reports from the captured Zephyrian vessels, and he realized that humanity's victory had been just the beginning, because the Empire would respond with overwhelming force, and conventional tactics would not work against an enemy that outnumbered them 50-1. Admiral Beth Wilson took command of the expanded human fleet, and she knew that trying to fight the Imperial War fleet in a direct battle would be suicide, so she began developing strategies that played to humanity's strengths in creativity and adaptability, and she decided to make the aliens fight a war they had never experienced. Captain Danny Clark received orders to form special operations teams that could strike deep into Imperial territory, and his mission was to attack supply lines and communication networks and manufacturing facilities, while the main fleet kept the Imperial War fleet busy and confused about where the real threats were coming from. The first phase of Colonel Foster's asymmetric warfare strategy began with simultaneous attacks on 12 Imperial outposts scattered across 6 star systems, and each attack used different tactics and weapons to prevent the aliens from developing effective countermeasures, and the psychological impact was immediate. Human strike teams led by Commander Alex Turner began appearing throughout Imperial space like ghosts that could strike anywhere and disappear before reinforcements arrived, and they used captured alien technology combined with human innovation to create weapons that the Empire's defenses could not stop. Admiral Wilson realized that humanity's greatest advantage was that the Zephyrians had grown predictable through centuries of easy conquest, so she ordered her captains to use tactics that were completely illogical by Imperial standards, and this confusion became a weapon as powerful as any plasma cannon. The Imperial War fleet under Grand Admiral Morduch arrived in the Sol system expecting to find human forces arranged in defensive formations around Earth, but instead they found empty space and automated beacons, broadcasting messages that taunted them about their previous defeat and challenged them to find the human fleet. Captain Lisa Park commanded a battle group that struck an Imperial supply convoy 3 systems away from Earth, while the Imperial War fleet searched for enemies that were not there, and her ships captured enough supplies and equipment to support human operations for months while denying resources to the Empire. Colonel Nina Phillips led liberation missions to worlds that had been conquered by the Empire decades ago, and she taught enslaved species how to build weapons from industrial equipment and how to coordinate resistance movements, and soon Imperial garrison forces were facing uprisings on dozens of worlds. Dr. Kevin Hayes analyzed captured Imperial technology and discovered that Zephyrian weapons and defenses were designed to counter other Imperial-level civilizations, but had weaknesses against the unconventional approaches that humans naturally used, and he began developing new weapons that exploited these blind spots. The Empire's communication networks began failing, as human hackers infiltrated their quantum communication systems, and Commander Tony Mitchell led cyber warfare teams that planted viruses in Imperial databases and turned alien technology against itself in ways the designers never anticipated. Grand Admiral Mordek found himself fighting a war unlike anything in Imperial history because every time his forces moved to engage human fleets, they discovered the humans had already moved somewhere else and were attacking targets the Empire had thought were perfectly safe. Admiral Wilson's strategy of forcing the Empire to defend everything simultaneously began working as Imperial forces spread thin across hundreds of systems, trying to protect supply lines and garrison worlds and manufacturing facilities from human attacks that could come from any direction at any time. Captain Danny Clark's Special Operations teams began working with liberated species to create a network of resistance movements that stretched across Imperial space, and suddenly the Zephyrians found themselves fighting not just humans but dozens of species they had thought were permanently subjugated. The psychological warfare component of human strategy proved especially effective as Commander Alex Turner began broadcasting footage of Imperial defeats and human victories to conquered worlds, and the myth of Imperial invincibility crumbled as species that had been enslaved for generations began to believe freedom was possible. Engineer Brad Thompson developed mobile manufacturing units that could be hidden in asteroid fields and produce weapons and equipment for resistance movements, and these factories moved constantly to avoid detection while supplying the growing rebellion with everything they needed to fight. Admiral Beth Wilson coordinated attacks that struck Imperial forces from multiple directions simultaneously, and the aliens found themselves unable to predict where humans would appear next because human tactics changed constantly and followed no pattern that Imperial computers could analyze. The Imperial Warfleet spent months chasing human forces that always stayed just out of reach, while human strike teams destroyed Imperial infrastructure throughout the galaxy. And Grand Admiral Mordek began to realize that he was losing a war against an enemy that refused to fight on Imperial terms. Susan Wells studied reports from liberated worlds, and she discovered that the Empire's control depended entirely on the belief that resistance was impossible, and once that belief was shattered, the entire Imperial system began collapsing from within as conquered species rediscovered their will to fight. Colonel Ryan Foster's asymmetric warfare strategy reached its peak when human forces began teaching other species how to build their own fleets using captured Imperial technology, and suddenly the Empire faced not just human rebels but a growing coalition of free worlds that fought with human tactics and weapons. Captain Lisa Park led a daring raid on an Imperial shipyard that produced the Empire's most advanced warships, and her forces not only destroyed the facility but captured the construction plans and technology specifications that would allow humanity to build even more powerful vessels. The tide of war had turned completely as Admiral Wilson's unconventional strategies proved that the Zephyrian Empire could be defeated by an enemy that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. And Emperor Zulfax began to understand that his empire was facing not just military defeat but complete collapse. Grand Admiral Mordek sent increasingly desperate reports to the Emperor explaining that human forces were everywhere and nowhere, and that conventional Imperial tactics were useless against an enemy that treated every rule of warfare as a suggestion to be ignored and every impossible maneuver as a challenge to be attempted. The empire that had ruled the galaxy for centuries was discovering that their greatest weakness was their own success, because they had grown so powerful that they had forgotten how to adapt and innovate, and now they faced an enemy that did nothing but adapt and innovate, and had turned their own strength against them. The Zephyrian Empire was burning from within as rebellion spread like wildfire across worlds that had been peaceful for centuries, and Emperor Zulfax watched his domain crumble while human advisors taught enslaved species how to fight with tactics that turned Imperial technology against itself, and he realized his greatest mistake had been underestimating the determination of a species that had never learned to surrender. Commander Alex Turner stood in the command center of a liberated world that had thrown off Imperial rule after 40 years of occupation, and he watched former slaves organizing themselves into military units, using weapons built from mining equipment and communication systems, and he knew this was happening on dozens of worlds. Throughout the galaxy, the Imperial communication networks carried reports of defeats and uprisings that would have been impossible just months earlier, and species that had forgotten their own names were rediscovering their identities and fighting back against oppressors who had seemed invincible until humans showed them that the Empire could bleed. Colonel Nina Phillips coordinated the liberation of an entire star system by teaching the indigenous population how to disable Imperial orbital platforms using modified industrial fabricators, and the sight of Zephyrian ships being destroyed by species they had enslaved filled her with satisfaction that went beyond military victory. Admiral Beth Wilson received intelligence reports showing that Imperial forces were being stretched to the breaking point as they tried to contain rebellions while still fighting human forces, and she realized the Empire was facing the classic problem of all tyrants who discover they cannot oppress everyone at once. Captain Danny Clark led a joint operation with 3 liberated species to destroy an Imperial fortress that had controlled a strategic trade route for over a century, and watching former enemies work together against their common oppressor reminded him why humanity had chosen to fight rather than surrender. Emperor Zulfax called an emergency session of the Imperial High Command, and his advisors argued among themselves about how to respond to the growing crisis. While some suggested negotiating with the humans, and others demanded that entire rebellious systems be sterilized as examples to others. Grand Admiral Morduk reported that his forces were being defeated not by superior technology, but by tactics that no Imperial strategist had ever conceived, and he described human commanders who treated warfare like an art form rather than a science, and who seemed to enjoy finding new ways to make the impossible happen. The Emperor's rage reached levels that frightened even his most loyal advisors, and he declared that he would personally lead the Imperial Corps fleet to Earth and destroy the human homeworld, even if it meant sacrificing half his remaining forces, because his pride could not tolerate defeat at the hands of primitive mammals. Dr. Kevin Hayes analyzed captured Imperial intelligence reports and discovered that the rebellion was spreading faster than the Empire could contain it, and he calculated that within 6 months the Zephyrians would lose control of over 200 star systems unless they could find a way to stop the human-inspired uprising. Admiral Wilson coordinated a massive operation that involved simultaneous strikes on Imperial targets across 30 systems, and each attack was timed to prevent Imperial forces from responding effectively, and the psychological impact of such coordinated resistance broke the morale of garrison troops throughout the Empire. Captain Lisa Park received reports that Imperial ships were beginning to defect as their crews realized they were fighting for a losing cause, and some Zephyrian officers were secretly providing information to human forces, while others simply abandoned their posts and disappeared into civilian populations. The liberation movement reached a tipping point when Commander Tony Mitchell helped establish a communication network that connected resistance movements across the galaxy, and suddenly, isolated rebel groups realized they were part of a massive uprising that spanned hundreds of worlds. Colonel Ryan Foster studied the strategic situation, and he understood that the Empire was experiencing something it had never faced before, which was the complete loss of legitimacy as conquered species stopped believing that Imperial rule was inevitable and began working together to throw off their chains. Emperor Zultax made his decision in a moment of rage that would cost him everything, and he ordered the Imperial Corps fleet to assemble for the final battle that would either restore Imperial dominance or destroy what remained of his power, and he chose 10,000 of his most loyal ships for the assault on Earth. President Lisa Taylor received intelligence about the Imperial fleet assembling for what appeared to be a final assault, and she knew this would be the battle that determined whether humanity survived as a free species or became a cautionary tale about the price of defying Galactic Empire's General Kyle Rodriguez activated every defensive system that Earth possessed, and he coordinated with Admiral Wilson to position human forces for the battle that would decide the fate of not just humanity but every species that had joined the rebellion against Imperial tyranny. Dr. Hayes worked frantically to complete Project Prometheus, which was humanity's most ambitious weapon system, and he knew they would need every advantage they could get because the Imperial Core Fleet represented the concentrated military might of an empire that had ruled the galaxy for centuries. The Emperor broadcast a message to every human settlement, declaring that he would personally oversee the destruction of their species, and his voice carried the fury of a ruler who had never been challenged and who intended to make an example that would discourage rebellion for generations. Admiral Wilson coordinated with resistance movements throughout the galaxy to launch diversionary attacks that would prevent Imperial reinforcements from reaching Earth, and she knew that the outcome of the coming battle would determine whether the rebellion succeeded or died with humanity. Captain Danny Clark prepared his special forces for what might be their final mission, and he knew that if humanity lost this battle, then every species that had joined the rebellion would face extinction as the Empire took revenge for the humiliation of being challenged by inferior beings. The Imperial Core Fleet began moving toward Earth, and sensors throughout human space detected a concentration of military power that dwarfed anything seen in galactic history, and Admiral Wilson realized they were about to face an enemy that represented the accumulated might of centuries of conquest. Commander Alex Turner sent a final message to the liberated worlds, telling them that humanity was about to face the ultimate test, and that regardless of the outcome they had proven that the Empire could be defeated and that freedom was possible for those brave enough to fight for it. Engineer Brad Thompson put the finishing touches on defensive systems that incorporated technology from dozens of different species, and he realized that humanity's greatest weapon was not any particular piece of equipment, but their ability to learn from others and adapt their knowledge to new situations. The stage was set for the final confrontation as Emperor Zulfax led his massive fleet toward Earth with the intention of ending human resistance once and for all, while humanity prepared to either win their freedom or die fighting. And in the darkness between stars, both sides knew that the outcome would reshape the galaxy. President Taylor stood in the command center watching the approaching Imperial fleet, and she thought about the choice her species had made to fight rather than surrender, and she knew that whatever happened in the coming battle, humanity had already achieved something no other species had managed, which was proving that the Empire was not invincible. The Imperial Core Fleet arrived at Earth like a swarm of metal locusts that blotted out the stars, and Emperor Zulfax stood on the bridge of his flagship watching the blue marble that had spawned the species responsible for his empire's humiliation. And he felt anticipation mixed with rage as he prepared to personally oversee the extinction of humanity. Admiral Beth Wilson watched the tactical display showing 10,000 enemy ships approaching Earth, and she knew this was the moment that would determine whether humanity's rebellion had been a brief flicker of defiance or the beginning of a new age of freedom. And she activated the final phase of humanity's desperate defense plan. Captain Jake Morrison had been promoted to fleet commander after surviving the first contact disaster, and he coordinated the human forces that seemed pitifully small compared to the approaching Imperial Armada. But he remembered the words that Lieutenant Amy Chun had spoken months ago about finding out what happens when you mess with humanity. Dr. Kevin Hayes initiated Project Prometheus from his hidden command center, and the quantum-linked weapon network that humanity had built throughout the solar system came online with power levels that made the scientists nervous because they had never tested the system at full capacity, and they were about to find out if their calculations were correct. Emperor Zulfax broadcast his final ultimatum to Earth, demanding that humanity surrender immediately and prepare for extermination as an example to other species, and his voice carried the authority of centuries of conquest as he promised that human resistance would end within hours. President Lisa Taylor responded with a message that was broadcast not just to the Imperial fleet but to every corner of the galaxy, and her words were simple and direct. As she said, humanity had made their choice to fight for freedom, and they would rather die as free beings than live as slaves. The battle began when the Imperial Core Fleet opened fire with weapons that could melt continents and the space around Earth lit up with energy beams that carried the concentrated fury of an empire determined to crush the rebellion that threatened their absolute power. Admiral Wilson's defensive strategy revealed itself as human ships appeared from hidden positions throughout the solar system, and they moved with coordination that seemed impossible given their smaller numbers, but each vessel knew exactly where to be and when to strike for maximum effect. Commander Tony Mitchell led his stealth squadrons in attacks that materialized from empty space, and his quantum torpedoes struck Imperial ships that had thought themselves safely protected by their own fleet, and he watched Zephyrian vessels explode in confusion as they tried to understand how humans could be everywhere. At once, Project Prometheus reached full activation, and the quantum-linked weapons throughout the solar system began firing in perfect synchronization, and the Imperial fleet discovered that Earth's entire star system had been turned into a massive weapon that could strike them from any angle. Captain Lisa Park commanded the flagship Retribution as it led human forces in a direct assault on the Imperial center, and her ship took devastating damage, but the adaptive armor and quantum shields held long enough for her weapons to reach the Emperor's personal command ship. Emperor Zulthax felt his flagship shudder under human fire, and for the first time in his life he experienced fear as he realized his supposedly invincible fleet was being torn apart by an enemy that refused to follow any rational pattern of warfare. Captain Danny Clark coordinated boarding actions against disabled Imperial vessels, and his Marines moved through alien corridors using combat tactics that the Zephyrians had no defense against, and they captured crucial intelligence about Imperial command structures and defensive capabilities. The tide of battle turned when Commander Alex Turner broadcast footage of the fight to every rebellious world throughout the galaxy, and enslaved species watched humans standing toe-to-toe with the Imperial core fleet, and they realized that the Empire could be beaten by anyone brave enough to try. Dr. Hayes monitored the performance of Project Prometheus, and he watched in amazement as the quantum-linked weapons network performed beyond their wildest projections, and Imperial ships that had seemed invulnerable began falling to weapons that turned their own technology against them. Admiral Wilson coordinated the human fleet with precision that seemed impossible given the chaos of battle, but every captain knew their role, and they executed maneuvers that looked like coordinated dancing while delivering firepower that cracked Imperial ships like eggs. Emperor Zulthax realized his fleet was not just losing but being systematically destroyed by an enemy that had turned warfare into an art form, and he ordered his personal guard to prepare for ramming attacks because he would rather die than face the humiliation of defeat. The battle reached its climax when Captain Morrison led a desperate assault on the Imperial flagship, and his ship took damage that should have been fatal, but human engineering kept them fighting long enough to breach the enemy's defenses and strike at the heart of Imperial power. Commander Mitchell's final attack run took him straight through the Imperial fleet's defensive screen, and his ship was destroyed in a blaze of glory that lit up the void of space, but his sacrifice created the opening that human forces needed to reach the Emperor's ship. The explosion that destroyed Emperor Zulthax and his flagship was visible from Earth's surface, and Admiral Wilson knew the battle was won when she saw Imperial ships beginning to break formation and flee rather than continue fighting without their supreme commander. Project Prometheus fired its final salvo, and the quantum weapons network delivered a coordinated strike that shattered what remained of Imperial resistance, and Captain Park watched enemy ships surrender or flee while the space around Earth filled with the debris of Imperial ambition. The aftermath of the battle saw human forces capturing thousands of Imperial prisoners, including high-ranking officers who provided detailed intelligence about the Empire's internal structure and weaknesses, and Dr. Hayes realized they now had everything they needed to completely dismantle Imperial power. News of the Emperor's death spread throughout the galaxy faster than Imperial forces could suppress it, and rebellions that had been simmering for months suddenly exploded into open warfare as conquered species realized the Empire no longer had the strength to maintain control. Admiral Wilson coordinated with liberation movements across hundreds of worlds, and she watched as the Zephyrian Empire collapsed system by system while former slaves used human tactics and weapons to throw off centuries of oppression. President Taylor addressed the galaxy from Earth, and she proposed the creation of a galactic federation based on voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission, and her words carried hope to species that had forgotten what freedom meant. The first law passed by the new Federation became known as the Find Out Doctrine, and it stated that any species committing unprovoked aggression against Federation members would face the full consequences of their actions, regardless of their military power or political influence. Captain Morrison was promoted to admiral and placed in command of Federation Defense Forces, and he kept a simple sign on his desk that read, "Mess around and find out," as a reminder to potential aggressors about the price of threatening peaceful species. Former Admiral Vexstar sat in a Federation rehabilitation center, and when asked what he had learned from the war, he replied that humanity had taught the galaxy never to pick a fight with a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning how to kill things more dangerous than themselves. The galaxy had learned that empires built on fear and oppression would always fall when confronted by species brave enough to fight for their freedom, and humanity had proven that sometimes the best response to bullies is to show them exactly why their victims should not be underestimated.